The beacon had been running for 47,000 years when I came to work it. That is the figure that will not leave me. Not the 22 vessels. Not the 9 days it took the separated cruiser to complete its close approach. Not even Sen, though she is the one I come back to last, always last, the way you come back to a closed door at the end of a long hall and stand there longer than makes sense. The number that hollows me out when I sit with it, and I have sat with it far more in the months since the event than is probably healthy, is 47,000 years. That is how long the beacon had been running before it was ever needed. I have to be precise about what that means, because imprecision is the enemy of this work, and I have spent 13 years learning to treat it that way. The beacon had not been running in a standby state, doing nothing, waiting passively the way a tool waits in a drawer. It had been running continuously, actively calibrated, maintained by an unbroken succession of engineers and watch officers who logged every frequency drift, every array performance check, every thermal load variance in the seabed anchor hardware, every signal-to-noise ratio measurement. The maintenance log runs to 46,000 individual entries over the program's operational history. The earliest entries are in a notation system that requires translation software because the convention changed 17 times in 47,000 years. The most recent entry before the event was from 6 weeks prior. Routine calibration, array 7 frequency offset holding at corrected value, all systems nominal, beacon harmonic stable. 47,000 years of work for a moment that had not yet come. I am Watch Officer 3rd grade at Accord Temporal Anomaly Station Varath Solon, and I had been that for 11 years when the moment came. Before Varath Solon, 12 years on the monitoring rotation at Accord Deep Range Post Kale 7, which is an asteroid-anchored station in the outer approach corridor, and cold enough in the uninsulated access passages that you understand, on a cellular level, why humans first built fires. Before that, 6 years training at the Accord Temporal Anomaly Watch Division's induction facility on the Calath Plateau, where the lead instructor on fold physics, a woman named Harith Vane, who had been working the division for 31 years and had the patience of something that had grown rather than been made, told the new intake on the first morning of training, "You may work your entire career and never see an emergence event. That is not failure. That is the job. The job is the watch, and the watch is its own justification." She was not wrong. She was also, in my case, not quite right. Varath Solon sits on the seawall at the Calath Shelf approach, 300 meters above the North Atlantic, built into the cliff face when the seawall was raised, which was 11,000 years ago, which makes the station young by the division's standards. Most of the infrastructure here is young by those standards. The Calath megacity behind me, the towers visible from the observation deck on clear days as a complicated geometry of glass and alloy reaching up into the marine haze, is 9,000 years old at its oldest quarter and still growing at its edges, where the construction platforms run day and night, adding to a skyline that has been under continuous revision for longer than most civilizations have existed. The human warships that cross the sky above it, kilometers long, their running lights visible from the surface as slow-moving constellations, have been part of the city's daily visual vocabulary for so long that the residents stopped remarking on them many generations ago. Children who grow up here do not look up. They know the warships are there the way they know the seawall is there. It is simply part of what the world is. I never stopped looking up. That is a personal failing that I have made my peace with. Below the station, where the Calath Shelf drops away and the ocean goes deep, the beacon array is anchored to the seabed at 800 meters. You cannot see the array from the observation deck. The water is too deep for light to reach, and too cold for clarity even if it weren't. But you can hear it, or rather you can feel it, because the harmonic the beacon produces at its operational frequency transmits through the station's hull as a pressure rather than a sound. It is the difference between hearing a note and feeling it in your chest. By the end of my first year at Verath Solon, I had stopped noticing it consciously. By the end of the third year, it had become the baseline against which silence felt wrong. There were nights, working late in the monitoring room or sitting in the officer's common area reading, when I would realize the harmonic had been absent from my awareness for hours, and I would sit still for a moment and locate it again, running below everything else the way a foundation runs below a building. Invisible, structural, present. When the emergence alarm sounded at 3:12 on the 14th of March, the first thing I registered was not the alarm. It was the harmonic shifting. A quarter tone rise, then a sustained oscillation that the hull transmitted as something between a hum and a shiver, a chord changing under the building. My bunk is on the fourth sublevel, 140 meters below the observation deck, and I felt the change through the mattress frame before the alarm reached me. I was sitting up before the sound registered consciously. My body knew before the rest of me caught up. I have thought about that sequencing many times since. The beacon knew before the instruments finished processing. Or rather, the beacon's response to the fold scar activation was faster than our instrument interpretation layer, and the change in its harmonic was the first legible signal I received. Which means the 47,000-year record of consistent frequency was the thing that made the deviation immediately perceptible. You can only hear a change against a known constant. By the time I reached the operations floor, 4 minutes, full kit, I have run that corridor in the dark enough times to do it without thinking. Senior Watch Officer Daleth Wren was at the primary console, and the floor was lit in the amber that the division uses for emergence probable, which is one step below confirmed. Daleth had 22 years in the division. She had the quality that long service in this work produces in certain people. Not calm, exactly, but an absolute absence of wasted motion. She did not look up when I came through the hatch. "Fold scar activation," she said. Kale approach vector, outer boundary. Coherence pattern matches the Vrathkin signature on all 9 identification indices. I sat down at the secondary station and pulled up the scar data. The Vrathkin fold scar had been in the monitoring catalog since year 14 of the Accord Temporal Watch program, which made it the second oldest continuous watch file in division history. 47,000 years of observation records. The file index alone occupied 11 terabytes. I had read the executive summary during training at the Caliph Plateau. Every division trainee does. It is part of the foundational curriculum. And the central fact of it was this. 49,000 years ago, in the concluding phase of a conflict that Earth's historical records now called the Vrathkin Partition Conflict, a force of 22 Vrathkin warships executed a coordinated fold drive jump intended to flank a compact defensive formation positioned in the outer approach. The fold jump had failed. All 22 vessels entered fold space, and the fold did not release them. The spatial anomaly left by a failed fold of that magnitude, the scar, had been detectable ever since, growing slightly in size and complexity over the first 1,000 years of Earth's detection capability, then stabilizing into a predictable signature that the division had been cataloging with increasing precision ever since. What the fold retention theorists had concluded by year 20,000 of the program, a conclusion that had been tested, refined, argued over, and ultimately upheld with a confidence level the theoretical physicists described as near certainty, was that fold space was not destructive to what it contained. The interior was stable. The vessels were in there, or had been in there when they entered, and the drives that sustained them were still running on the fold's residual energy. They were alive, probably, or had been alive for some portion of the elapsed time. And if the fold ever released them, they would emerge with their internal time intact, their sense of sequence preserved, and their external time 49,000 years behind them. The beacon existed because of that conclusion. It had been proposed in year 11,400 of the Watch program. The The proposal came from a fold retention analyst named Callan Death, who had spent 40 years working the Vrathkin Scar file and had concluded, carefully, in the language of someone who had been accused of catastrophism before and knew how to armor her reasoning, that a fleet emerging from 49,000 years of fold retention would not simply be a fleet 49,000 years out of date. It would be a fleet that did not know it was out of date. Its internal time would be intact. Its last operational context would be a war. Its weapons would be charged. Its standing orders would be from a command authority that had ceased to exist before recorded history. And it would arrive in a solar system it did not recognize, surrounded by infrastructure it could not interpret, broadcasting distress on frequencies that Earth's instruments would classify as antique. The danger was not the weapons. The weapons were old and Earth was not what it had been. The danger was the disorientation. A fleet that could not find a stable reference point would default, Death argued, to its last coherent operational state, which was combat. Not out of malice, out of the same reflex that makes a startled animal bite. The fold would release them into incomprehensibility, and incomprehensibility at that scale in a war configuration fleet was the threat. The recommendation was not a weapon aimed at the Scar. The recommendation was a door left open. A beacon. A deep care signal on the fold Scar's predicted emergence vector, calibrated to Vrathkin fold drive frequencies, broadcasting a single navigational gradient. Here is a fixed point, here is something steady, come toward this rather than toward the incomprehensible. If the fleet emerged, it would find one thing in its environment that it could follow. Not a threat, not a trap, a light in the window. The proposal was debated for 200 years. I have read significant portions of that debate in the division archives, and it is an education in the difficulty of committing to a patience that outlasts everyone doing the committing. Every generation of reviewers had to recommit. Every generation had to find reasons to keep spending resources on infrastructure for an event that might never occur. Every generation had to resist the argument, a reasonable argument, which kept being made, that the fold might never release its contents, and the beacon was a permanent cost for a speculative benefit. The argument on the other side, made by Death and by every subsequent analyst who held her position, was simpler. We do not know when the fold will release them, if it releases them. We know what will happen if it does, and we have not prepared. We know what will happen if it does, and we have prepared. The cost of the beacon is the cost of a maintenance crew and an engineering team. The cost of the alternative, if the fold releases and we have nothing ready, is a measurement we cannot make in advance but would prefer not to make afterward. The beacon was funded. The first installation was completed in year 12,008 of the program. It had been rebuilt 17 times since. What I was looking at on the secondary console, as the operations floor filled around me and the amber light held and then stepped up to red, was the fold Scar coherence index climbing past 900 on a scale of 1,000. The emergence confirmed threshold was 950. We reached it at 317. Confirmed emergence, Daleth said. The floor went full active, 31 people at stations. Accord Temporal Response Fleet alerted at Calathouter staging point, 12 vessels, lead ship Accord's patient record, Commander Vase Terran. The response fleet was not a combat fleet. I want to be precise about that, because the distinction mattered in how they operated and why they existed. The Temporal Response Fleet's function was reception. Its vessels were configured for communication relay, extended-range beacon support, diplomatic interface, and medical response. It carried weapons because it operated in the outer approach, and the outer approach can produce situations that require weapons, but its design intent was not engagement. It was the hand that meets a hand extended in uncertainty. Vase Terran had the fleet underway within 19 minutes of our alert transmission. The fold released 19 of the 22 vessels in the first 4 minutes. The other three came through over the following 20 minutes in what the fold physics team at the Caliph Plateau would subsequently call a coherent stagger, an emergent spread produced by micro-variations in the fold's internal pressure at the moment of release, which caused the vessel's phase alignment to resolve at slightly different times. All 22 were confirmed through by 3:44. Hull integrity readings on 18 of them within the hour. The other 4 were emitting drive signatures consistent with powered vessels, but their hull telemetry was scrambled with what the fold physics team identified as fold residue static, a charge retained in the hull plating from extended fold exposure, which would dissipate in time but could not be rushed. What the fleet was not doing was organizing. They were not forming up. They were not running a tactical spread. They were not, as far as our instruments could determine, communicating with each other in any coherent protocol. The signal traffic coming from the formation was disorganized in a way that took the division's senior signal analysts the better part of 3 days to properly characterize, because it was not jamming, not encryption, not damage, it was recursion. The signals were looping. The timestamps on Vrathkin internal communications were cycling through a compressed sequence from the hours immediately before the fold jump. Call and response patterns, navigation confirmations, tactical acknowledgments from a period 49,000 years past. As if the fleet's collective sense of temporal sequence had been disrupted at the moment of fold entry, scrambled in the fold space interior, and was now trying to re-establish itself by returning repeatedly to the last moment it had been coherent, not remembering exactly, unable to find anything more recent to stand on. Dishronometry, the inability to sequence time correctly. The fold physicists had been theorizing about it as a probable side effect of long-duration fold retention for 30,000 years, watching it in the live signal data, watching 22 crews circle back to the same 49,000-year-old moment, looking for ground that wasn't there, was something no theoretical description prepared you for. The beacon was the only fixed point they had. I watched it work across the first 12 hours on the sensor display. The formation drifted inward, not on a coordinated course, not with any sign of navigation planning, but following a gradient. The beacon was painting a directional signature into the fold residue cloud the formation was trailing, and the vessels were following it the way anything lost follows a light, without quite deciding to, without knowing what was ahead, because the light was steady and everything else was not. Senkale told me to sleep at 5:30. She was senior beacon engineer, 58 years old, 29 years at Verath Solon. She had come to the division from an engineering background in deep ocean infrastructure, which was not the usual path. Most beacon engineers came up through fold physics or material science, but which gave her a practical precision about hardware that the fold physics graduates sometimes lacked. She was the person who had identified, 3 years into her tenure, a small systematic error in the beacon's frequency offset calibration that her predecessor had accepted as sufficiently accurate. It had been close. She had determined it was not close enough. She had spent 3 years running fold residue propagation models before she was able to quantify the error precisely, and then she had filed a correction proposal and waited 14 months for the Accord technical review to evaluate it. And during those 14 months, she had continued logging the existing calibration data without complaint, and filed a supplementary data package at the 8-month mark without editorializing. When the approval came through, she rebuilt the beacon array herself over 46 days, with a team of 4, and when the rebuild was certified, she logged the corrected frequency offset in the maintenance record and returned to the normal watch rotation. I had been the junior engineer on that rebuild. That was how I knew her. She came to the operations floor at 5:30 and looked at the formation drift data for 4 minutes, checking the beacon response curves on the secondary display, and then she said, without preamble, "They are following the gradient. The calibration is holding. Go rest. I will call you." I went. I slept 2 hours and came back to a formation that had moved another 40,000 kilometers inward, and a beacon calibration display that Sen described, when I arrived, as clean. Clean, she said. She was still at the console. I was not certain she had moved. Not approximate, clean. The frequency lock is holding within the corrected tolerance on all 8 arrays. She said this the way she said anything about the beacon's performance. As a technical observation, in the language of technical observations, in a tone that did not distinguish between good technical outcomes and expected technical outcomes, because the expected outcome was the correct one, and producing it was the job. Over the next 3 days, the formation drifted inward. On day 4, at 400,000 kilometers from the inner threshold, a single vessel separated from the main body. It was the third largest in the group. Our classification system identified it as a mid-weight cruiser, a vessel class that the Vrathkin records in the division's archives catalogued as a patrol and assessment ship, a design intended for extended independent operation. The separation happened gradually enough that our tactical analysts and I spent several hours arguing about whether it was deliberate. My position was that it was not deliberate in the operational sense. The formation's drift vector had shifted slightly at that point due to an eddy in the fold residue cloud, and the cruiser's separation looked like one vessel tracking the beacon frequency with better sensitivity than the others, and not registering the gap that opened behind it as it pulled ahead. The tactical analysts pointed to the vessel's subsequent course maintenance and said a purely passive system would not maintain a course that precisely. We were both looking at the same data. We were neither of us certain. I am still not certain, and I have reviewed the sensor record many times in the months since. What I can say is that, whether the separation was deliberate or not, the vessel's behavior after it was consistent. It tracked the beacon gradient. It did not accelerate aggressively. It maintained a velocity profile that was cautious to the point of being slow, and it crossed the inner threshold at 2:14 on day 4 without any change in bearing that our instruments could classify as a threat approach. The response fleet held position at the inner threshold. Vase Terran held it there without flinching for 4 days and 7 hours while a disoriented alien warship drifted toward Earth's largest coastal city. I have tried to find the right word for what that requires. Discipline is too small. Trust, maybe, trust in the work that 47,000 years had built. Trust that the beacon would do what it had been built to do. Trust that patience was the correct instrument for this situation, even when patience meant watching and waiting while a weapons-capable vessel closed the distance. The beacon anchor point was 6 kilometers below the North Atlantic at the Calith Shelf Base. The cruiser stopped its inward drift at 48 kilometers above the ocean surface. From the Varath Solon observation deck, we could see it on the horizon, a dark angular shape against the pre-dawn sky, lit underneath by the city's upwash of light. The glow of 9,000 years of human construction reflecting off the underside of something 900 meters long that had been built 49,000 years ago for a war that Earth had won before anyone alive could remember. It was not graceful. No warship built for necessity is graceful. The forward sections were heavily armored in the dark alloy we stopped producing 11,000 years ago when we found better materials, and the impact scars on the fore plating were older than every building in the Calith megacity behind me. The sensor clusters were asymmetric in the way that spoke of field modifications, hardware added or relocated under time pressure, functionality prioritized over geometry. It was a working vessel. It had been built to be used and it had been used, and then it had been caught in the fold for 49,000 years with those modifications still on its hull, unchanged, unrepaired, exactly as they had been in the last operational moment its crew had understood. Sen came to the observation deck. She brought 2 cups of something hot and stood next to me and did not say anything for a long time. The cruiser held its altitude. The city's light played on its hull. 47,000 years, I said. She nodded. 47,038 days as of this morning. A pause. The frequency lock is still clean. We transmitted the welcome packet at 3:12 on day 4, the 24-hour mark from the original emergence alarm, which was coincidence, though I have heard people try to make it significant. The transmission took 11 minutes at our highest bandwidth array. The welcome packet was the document the division had been building and revising continuously since year 8000 of the program, which made it a 39,000-year collaborative work. It ran to 412 million pages. I had read the organizational framework in training and had found it at the time somewhat abstract. I understood it now. The packet was not organized chronologically. The fold retention theorists had argued against chronological organization for 25,000 years, on the grounds that a crew experiencing temporal dischronometry, unable to sequence time reliably, could not anchor to a linear narrative. Asking them to begin at the beginning and proceed to the present was asking them to perform, as their first act of comprehension, the exact cognitive operation the fold had damaged. The concentric organization did not require sequencing. It required only proximity. The innermost ring was the simplest fact, the one fact with no dependencies and no prerequisites. It said, "This is how long you were inside the fold." One fact. No context required to understand it. The next ring expanded from that. This is what Earth became in that time. Then, the war you were fighting is finished, and here is the record of how. Then, here is the Vrathkin history in the elapsed period, preserved in full. Then, spreading outward through the rings, the entire contextual account, all 412 million pages of it, organized so that a mind re-establishing its grip on the present could work outward from the one central fact at whatever pace it could manage. The beacon had brought them to the door. The welcome packet opened it. We received acknowledgement of receipt 47 minutes after transmission completed. A single pulse at full drive frequency. A convention the division's Vrathkin language specialists identified from the 49,000-year-old records as a naval communication acknowledgement. Message received. Nothing further. I had been awake for 22 hours. I went and slept. What followed was 8 hours of silence. I have been asked about that silence many times, and I understand why people ask. They want to know about threat readiness, about contingency protocols, about what the Accord was prepared to do if the vessel made a hostile move during those 8 hours. I can tell them about all of that. It is documented, it was real. Vase Terran had contingency authorizations, and the response fleet was positioned and equipped and prepared. But when I think about those 8 hours, that is not what I think about. I think about what it must have been like inside that vessel. 22 crews disoriented and unmoored, in fold space that scrambled their sense of sequence for what was subjectively an unknown duration. Could have been hours, could have been years. Fold retention does not preserve a consistent subjective time. Emerging into a solar system they could not recognize, orbited by structures they had no frame for, broadcasting on frequencies that received no response in any language they knew. Finding one thing that was steady, the beacon, following it for days. Arriving at the anchor point, reading the innermost ring, this is how long you were inside, 49,000 years. Sitting with that. All of them together in their separate vessel and their scrambled present, sitting with the fact that 49,000 years had passed while they were inside. 8 hours feels appropriate to me. 8 hours feels, if anything, brief. At 1823 on day 4 the vessel transmitted. Old Vrathkin naval standard, which the division's linguists had been refining for 40,000 years and had decoded to a 94% confidence level. The transmission was brief. Through the translation filter, we have read the first ring. We do not yet fully understand. We are asking for time. Vase Terran's response was transmitted within 6 minutes. I was in the monitoring room with Sen when it came through on relay. We have been waiting 47,000 years. We can wait longer. Sen read it and said nothing. She was running the Day 4 calibration check. She turned back to the array diagnostic panel. After a moment she said, "That is the correct answer." Over the following 5 days, the vessel worked outward through the rings. 8 transmissions, each indicating they had moved to the next concentric layer. The second transmission came at 7:41 on day 5. We have read the second ring. We understand the scale of what Earth has become. We are asking to understand why. That word why stopped the translation team for 40 minutes. Not because the word was ambiguous in Vrathkin Naval Standard. It was not. It stopped them because it was the right question. 49,000 years of human development visible in a single orbital approach. The warships, the orbital infrastructure, the megacities, the defense architecture layered into every approach corridor. And the first thing the crew of that cruiser asked, after absorbing the scale of it, was not how or what or who. They asked why. What had made this necessary? What Earth had understood in the elapsed time that had produced this? The answer was in the third ring. Daleth drafted the relay confirmation response herself, which was not strictly her role but which nobody questioned. The confirmation said, "The third ring will address your question. It is a long ring. Take the time you need." The third transmission came 8 hours later. It was longer than the others. Several hundred kilobytes of encoded data accompanying the simple confirmation of receipt, which the translation team eventually decoded as a set of marginalia in old Vrathkin naval notation, comments written into the margin of the ring's text as they read it. The team spent 2 days on those marginalia. Most of them were technical observations, references to passages, cross-checks against their own records, the kind of notation a careful reader leaves when they want to return to something later. But near the end of the set, there was a phrase that the lead linguist flagged at confidence 91%. She translated it as, "We left them and they remembered." I read that translation on day 6, sitting at the secondary console at 200 with a cold cup on the desk, and I had to sit with it for a while before I could return to the monitoring logs. The 4th, 5th, and 6th transmissions were briefer, acknowledgments of receipt with minimal marginalia, which the linguists interpreted as the crew moving through the war record ring, the historical continuity ring, and the Vrathkin diaspora ring at a pace that suggested they were reading quickly, absorbing the outline rather than the detail, because the outline was enough. The full detail was there for them. They could return to it. What they needed, working outward ring by ring, was orientation. The fact that the war had ended, how, when, on what terms. The fact that Vrathkin civilization had continued and developed, and was now something substantially different from the empire that had dispatched these 22 vessels. The fact that the people they had left behind had not been waiting for them, had not known they were alive, had mourned them or not mourned them, or had no record of them at all, depending on which archive you consulted. And the division's welcome packet included multiple archives because the honest answer to every historical question was the full range of what the records showed, not the clean version. The main formation, receiving duplicate transmissions via relay from the isolated cruiser, was showing its own response. The recursive signal looping, the cycling back to 49,000-year-old timestamps, gradually slowed. By day 7, it had stopped in the 3 vessels nearest the cruiser. By day 9, it had stopped in all but 4 of the 22. Those 4 were the hull-scrambled vessels from the original emergence, whose fold residue static had not yet fully cleared. 2 of them cleared by day 11. The other 2 did not clear. The fold physics team's assessment, which arrived at my console in the weeks after the initial event, was precise and careful in the way that division documents are always precise and careful, and it said what it needed to say plainly. The remaining static in those 2 vessels was not a surface charge to be dissipated. It was structural. The fold residue had penetrated the hull materials in a way that indicated extended exposure at a fold retention level the other vessels had not experienced. Possibly because those 2 had been at the trailing edge of the formation when the fold initiated, possibly because of micro-variations in their drive architecture, possibly for reasons the physics did not yet fully explain. The hull contamination had affected the internal chronometer architecture of both vessels. The crews could be reached, could be helped, could over time and with the right expertise be supported towards something that functioned as a stable present. But the work would take years. It would require expertise the Accord's neurological specialists did not yet have and would need to develop in collaboration with Vrathkin physicians. And for some of the crew it might never be fully resolved. I think about those crews when people describe the event as a success. Not because it wasn't a success, it was. The record is clear on that, but because success that leaves two crews still circling in their own fractured time is a success that carries something inside it that I do not want to name too cleanly. The beacon worked. The preparation held. The accord was signed. The 20 vessels that were able to read the rings read them and found their footing and are now somewhere in Vrathkin space, received by a civilization 49,000 years past the one they left, alive and oriented and in possession of the full record. That is what we built for. I hold all of it at once. The 7th and 8th transmissions came on days 8 and 9 respectively. The 7th said, "We have read the full record. We understand what we have come back to. We are asking what you want from us." That sentence, "what you want from us," had been anticipated. The contingency drafts for it were in the Welcome Packet's operational annex, and they had been updated 17 times over the program's history as the diplomatic context evolved, and the Accord's understanding of the ethical dimensions of the situation matured. The response that was transmitted had been finalized 41,000 years ago by a committee that included, at its insistence, a Fold physicist named Arith Solon, who had argued in the committee minutes that the ethical dimensions of a fleet emerging from temporal displacement were not separable from the physics, and that any response to their question had to be drafted by people who understood what the Fold had done to them before they could understand what ought to be offered in return. The response was 2 sentences. "We want nothing from you. We made this place for you to come to, and it is yours for as long as you need it." The 8th transmission, received at 3:12 on day 9, 48 hours exactly after the vessel had crossed the inner threshold, said only, "We understand. We are grateful." Sen read the translation when I brought it to her at the Array 7 console. She was in the monitoring room, running the evening calibration check. She read it twice, set down the screen, picked up the Array 7 diagnostic tool, and returned to what she had been doing. After a moment she said, 41,000 years is a long time to wait to find out if a sentence lands correctly." I said, "Do you think it did?" She said, "The signal traffic from the formation is normalizing." Their marginalia on the 7th ring included 3 words the linguists translated as she paused, recalling the precise phrasing like a door left open. "So yes, I think it landed." The isolated cruiser made its close approach on day 9. The request had come through the translation filter as, "We wish to see the origin point of the signal. We wish to understand what guided us." The authorization was pre-approved, as I mentioned, a subcommittee contingency clearance, 1,200 years old. Vase Terran transmitted the approval and the safety parameters within 3 minutes of receiving the request. The vessel descended from 48 kilometers to 300 meters above the North Atlantic surface. It was mid-morning on a gray March day, overcast, the kind of Atlantic sky that holds all its light diffused in the cloud layer without releasing any of it as direct sun. At 300 meters, the vessel was close enough that on the observation deck we could see the texture of the hull plating without magnification, the dark alloy, the impact scars, the asymmetric sensor clusters. The sensor clusters were dark. Our instruments confirmed it, powered down, no active targeting emissions, no scanning arrays running. They had come down without instruments, looking with whatever the Vrathkin equivalent of eyes was directly at the sea. Below them, 800 meters down in the cold and the dark, the beacon array was running. The harmonic was in the station hull. I could feel it in my feet on the observation deck. There were 14 of us on the deck. Sen was next to me. Nobody spoke. The vessel held at 300 meters for 23 minutes. The light was gray and even, and the sea below was gray, and the vessel above us was the color of old iron, and it just stayed there. Not threatening, not signaling. Present in the way that something is present when it has arrived at the place it was trying to reach and is taking a moment before it moves again. Then it rose, slowly, the way something rises when there is no urgency to the departure. It climbed back toward the formation's holding position, and as it went I watched its exhaust dispersal pattern, which is a thing you watch when you have spent 11 years monitoring vessel behavior in this approach corridor. And the pattern was decelerated, steady, unhurried in a way that is distinct from tactical withdrawal, and distinct from fuel management, and distinct from any operational register I had ever logged in this approach vector. It moved like something that had arrived somewhere it had been trying to reach for a long time, and had seen it, and was now going home. Sen said the calibration held. I said it held. She said then it's done. She was right that the major work of the beacon was done. The work that followed, the formal diplomatic process, the Vrathkin Emergence Accord, the 3 months of intensive legal and historical negotiation conducted by teams far beyond my classification level, was not beacon work. It was the downstream work that the beacon made possible, because a disoriented fleet that had been guided to a stable point and given 412 million pages of context was a fleet that could negotiate. That was the premise of the whole endeavor. Not peace by force, peace by preparation. 47,000 years of preparation for a 3-month negotiation. The accord was signed on day 106. I was not in the room. I heard about it from Daleth, who had been invited to the signing ceremony as the division's operational representative, and came back to the station, moving with the contained quality of someone who has witnessed something they will be processing for years. It's done, she said. What does it look like? I asked. She thought about that for a moment. It looks like 2 parties who both know everything that happened and have decided to proceed from what they know rather than from what they assumed. She paused. The Vrathkin jurists were precise. Their tradition is 49,000 years removed from ours, but the precision is the same. I think Callan Death would have recognized them. Sen did not see the accord signed. She had told me in October of the previous year, a morning in the monitoring room when she was showing me the Array 7 correction procedure for the 3rd time, because she wanted to be certain I had it, the specific hand tool calibration and the frequency lock verification sequence, that she had perhaps until spring. She said it in the same tone she used to describe technical information. Here is what is true. Here is what it means for the work. Here is what I need you to know before it is true. She wanted me to have the Array 7 procedure. She wanted me to know where the hand-calibrated tool set was kept. She wanted me to understand the thermal load tolerance on Array 12, which ran slightly warm and had since before her time and was within spec, but required close attention in summer when the seabed temperature rose. She said, I want the beacon to continue correctly after I am not here to continue it. That is the thing I need to know is secured. I told her it was secured. She nodded and went back to the calibration check. She died on day 16 of the emergence event. In the medical bay at Verath Solon, in a small room with a north-facing window, with the Vrathkin formation still visible on the sensor display we had set up near the bed at her request. Not visible to the naked eye, they were too far out, but visible on the display, their signal pattern evolving toward coherence as the welcome packet's outer rings were processed. She had asked us to keep the display running because she wanted to watch the signal pattern normalize. She spent the last 3 days working, when the medical staff permitted it, on the final beacon calibration report for the event period. She finished the last entry at 2:11 on day 16. She died at 3:48. The entry reads, Array 7 frequency offset holding at corrected value. 49-day active guidance event concluded without calibration failure. Beacon ready for next watch cycle. Beacon ready for next watch cycle. I have read that entry more times than I can account for. I keep returning to the language, the specific choice of that phrasing over every other way she could have ended that record. She could have noted the historical significance of the event. She could have written something about 47,000 years. She could have named the cruiser or the formation or the Vrathkin cruise. She wrote, Beacon ready for next watch cycle. Which means I have done the work correctly. The work continues. The next person has what they need. That is, I have come to understand the highest thing this work produces, not the event, not the emergence, not the 49,000-year gap closed by 3 months of negotiation. The highest thing the work produces is the ability to hand it forward correctly. The beacon does not end. The watch does not end. The next watch cycle begins the moment this one closes. I am senior beacon engineer now. The position is formally mine as of 6 weeks after the accord signing. I do not use the language of filling Sen's position because that is not what I am doing. I am continuing her work, which is itself a continuation of the work of every engineer who preceded her, all the way back to the first installation in year 12,008, all the way back to Callan Death's proposal, all the way back to the decision 200 years after that proposal to commit to a patience that no individual human being would live to see resolved. Array 7 is holding at corrected value. Array 12 is running warm, as it always has, within tolerance, observed closely. 3 weeks ago I identified a minor thermal load anomaly in Array 12, not the standard warm-running variance but a new pattern. A slight shift in the thermal profile that suggested something worth investigating in the anchor hardware. I documented it. I ran the diagnostic sequence. I identified a microfracture in the thermal dissipation layer of the Array 12 seabed anchor bracket, and I corrected it with a procedure that required a hand tool, calibrated to tolerances that the maintenance division had to produce for me, because we do not carry them in standard stock. I have Sen's hand-calibrated tool set, which she built herself over years for exactly the kind of precision work the array requires, and I used it, and the correction held, and I logged it. The entry is unremarkable. It describes a technical correction in the language of technical corrections. The log will not note that I stood in the monitoring room after I completed the work and understood, in a way I could not have articulated before the 14th of March, what it means to write an entry like that, what it means to add one more correct data point to a record that will still be running when everyone who knows my name has been gone for thousands of years. I have been asked whether the work feels different now, whether tending a beacon that has already served its purpose changes the character of the watch. The answer depends on which part of the question you are asking. The work is the same. It has always been the same. Calibration checks, array performance logs, thermal load monitoring, frequency lock verification, the harmonic in the hull, the sea below, the sky above. The steady accumulation of correct entries in a record that will outlast everyone who makes them. That part has not changed and will not change, because that part is not about any single emergence event. It is about the next one, and the one after that, and the one that may not come for another 47,000 years. But the other part of the question, whether the meaning of the work has changed, I answer differently now than I would have on the morning of March 14th, before the alarm sounded, and the harmonic shifted, and I sat up in my bunk in the dark knowing that 47,000 years had just become necessary. I used to understand the work as the maintenance of a theoretical possibility. The fold might release. The beacon might be needed. We keep it ready because the cost of readiness is less than the cost of unreadiness. That is true, and it was always sufficient, and it kept the work honest. Sen worked from exactly that understanding for 29 years, and the work she produced from it was exact and correct and completely right. What I understand now that I did not understand then, not conceptually, but in the part of understanding that comes from having watched a thing actually happen, is what the beacon was for at the deepest level. It was not for an outcome. It was not even for the fleet exactly. It was for the moment when something lost follows a fixed point toward a place where it can stop circling and find ground. 22 vessels emerged into incomprehensibility with scrambled time sense and 49,000-year-old standing orders and nothing steady in any direction. One thing was steady. One signal had been precisely calibrated and continuously maintained, and was broadcasting at exactly the frequency it needed to be broadcasting at because 47,000 years of work had made it correct. They followed it. They came to the anchor point. They stopped circling. That is what patience produces, when patience is a thing you build rather than a thing you wait through. You build it one correct entry at a time, one array calibration at a time, one generation of watch officers handing the work to the next with the tools in good order and the records up to date. It accumulates, and what it becomes, over 47,000 years, is a beacon that holds its frequency locked through 9 days of active guidance without a single calibration failure, and brings 22 lost vessels to a place where they can read the smallest ring of truth first and work outward from there at their own pace. Sen built 9 years of that. The engineers before her built the rest. I am building now. The beacon is running. Array 7 is correct. Array 12's thermal anomaly has been resolved and documented. The maintenance log has its most recent entry. I begin my shift at 600 tomorrow. The work continues.